Hi, Gene Monterastelli here, the editor of tappingqna.com. The video that you are about to watch is a conversation that was a part of this year's 24 Hours of Tapping. The 24 Hours of Tapping is a fundraiser for the amazing work that is done by the Peaceful Heart Network. The Peaceful Heart Network has brought tapping to migrants, refugees, prisoners, and the underprivileged in over 30 countries all over the world. As you watch this video, if you learned something, if you were touched by it, if you were inspired by it, the easiest way to say thank you is to support the work of the Peaceful Heart Network. To do that, all you need to do is go to 24hoursoftapping.com/support. And as you look in the description and the first comment down below, you will see a direct link to that. I hope you enjoy this conversation. Next conversation is with David Feinstein. David is a clinical psychologist who has received 9 national awards for his books on consciousness and healing. He has served on the faculty at Antioch College and the Johns Hopkins School of Medicine. He and his wife, Donna Eden, have built one of the world's largest and most vibrant organizations that teach energy medicine. Here is David and I having a conversation about what happens with disaster relief and how tapping can be used in those first 28 days after a catastrophic event. Here's my conversation with David. First question I have for you, because I was reading through the research that you shared with me as we were getting ready for this topic, and one of the things that is mentioned inside of it over and over again is PTSD and trauma. And I think that we are in a much better place culturally where we're talking about these things in a public way and how it's appropriate to do that. But I also think it's good for us to have good, thoughtful, useful definitions about things like that. So from your point of view, in the research from someone who's well-trained and well-formed, when you use traumatic event, PTSD, could you give just some basic definitions as we kind of engage with how we respond to that? I think that would be useful for us.
Well, it used to be that trauma was something that people tried to bury. They tried to hide the aftermath of trauma. Mm-hmm. And now that we have a culture that's much more welcoming of people dealing with their traumatic events, we have more scientific understanding, and trauma really has to do with changes that go on in the brain. So when a person faces a situation that is beyond their coping ability, a situation that literally fries their circuits, the amygdala, the hippocampus, they all actually get rewired after trauma. They are rewired in a way that makes the person more sensitive to reliving the memories, more sensitive to environmental cues that re-trigger the memory. They're more likely to avoid situations that are reminiscent of the earlier experience. So it's not just something that happens in the mind, it's something that happens in the brain.
And so you mentioned some of the kind of long-term symptoms. What does that look like kind of day to day then as we're encountering that?
People have trouble sleeping. They have nightmares. They have nightmares that are so persistent that they can't count on a night of sleep. Some people go months, years without a really restful night of sleep. So that's a big one that people experience. Then there's daymares, which are called flashbacks, which are intrusive memories. The person can't stop the memory. They can't make it go away. They're just somebody's voice will remind them of their abuser's voice, and that memory just keeps on coming back all day. That kind of thing. So it becomes difficult to concentrate. It becomes difficult to really move on in a way that allows you to reclaim your life, to even rebuild your life. Even after successful treatment, people have to rebuild their lives because often there's been a large disruption in normal life. And so they need to, so you really want to have all the cards in your deck when you go about rebuilding your life. And if you're trying to rebuild your life while you're suffering with an inability to concentrate, poor sleep, it can be very damaging for relationships. People become a bit paranoid. They become more judgmental. They become more isolated. So all of these conditions really plague people after a trauma. Now, it's not that everybody that has a traumatic event gets PTSD. Estimates vary, but between 10 and 20% of people who go through a catastrophic event, most of them will go through severe anxiety and upset and disruption. And the definition of PTSD is that when that acute trauma reaction lasts for more than a month, then the diagnosis elevates to PTSD. So you, in working with somebody early on, you want to assure them that they're not going crazy, that it's normal for the mind to go into this kind of paralysis or overreaction, or not overreaction, but strong reaction after a catastrophic event. It's normal, but it will pass. But you also want to be careful to not say it in a way that promises it's going to pass, because for that 10 or 20% where it doesn't pass after a month, you don't want to have stigmatized them, so that you've sort of defined it that healthy people get over this in a month, but you didn't get it over in a month, so there's really something wrong with you. The fact is that they do have something that they need to deal with that's serious, but it's not that there's something wrong with them.
And somewhere along the way, and I can't remember the source of this, and that's why I'm careful not to quote it when I'm working with folks, but I'm curious your response, is that I've heard that events that are traumatic have characteristics of being extreme, isolating, and unexpected. Is that an accurate description of those sorts of catastrophic events, or is there something else going on that we can see? Well, if we add A plus B plus C plus something else that makes it happen in a certain percentage of people, like, are there particular characteristics of those events that make it more likely to experience that?
Yeah, well, human beings are so complex and have so many variables, and the situations have so many variables. It's really hard to generalize in that way. But you do have, the symptoms that I mentioned are pretty common. Not all of them necessarily, but some group of them are quite common. And isolation is certainly another one, that the more isolated the person is, the more their life starts to fall apart. So they can't do their job. If they're really emotionally keeping away from people, they can't be in their close relationships with their family if they're emotionally pushing away from people.
And I'm curious, you're talking about how kind of the brain rewires itself. Oftentimes, like working with something like a fear or a phobia, like on a certain level, I can see logically what is going on. My system is trying to keep me safe. It just has a disproportionate or misinformed belief system, but there's a function behind that. Is there a specific function behind the brain rewiring itself in that particular way after a catastrophic event? Is it just keeping itself on guard, or is that something that is not known?
So there's a self-protective mode to PTSD, because they've learned that the environment is dangerous and the brain goes into a response that tries to protect itself. But there's also a damage that happens. So it's beyond just self-protection. There's something that really goes wrong in the oversensitivity, the difficulty having joy, the difficulty in being able to be in the here and now without feeling reactivated. So it's more than just self-protection.
as you're saying that, more than like, I think of it like an old tube television that the colors are coming in way, way, way too bright and oversaturating everything. And so it's kind of the right image, but it's distorted in such a way that we're reacting to it and responding to it for something that is not actually real and there, just because of the way it's projecting as we're navigating that.
That's a great analogy.
Yeah. And so then as we think about, catastrophic events, natural disasters and stuff like that, is there something, and this seems like a silly question to say it out loud, is there something particular and specific about those types of events that are more pronounced? Because, like it's one thing to be in a circumstance where I have control, where if it's something that is natural, I'm much more likely to feel out of control in that. So is it more likely to happen with that sort of catastrophic event?
Yes, well, again, it's hard to generalize, but
right.
People, for instance, in warfare, will also have PTSD after horrible events, but there's an expectation. They've signed up for it.
Right.
They know that they are in danger, and so there is a different way of fielding the event. It doesn't make it any more palatable, but it fits their moral structure, their expectation better. Mm-hmm. Whereas when a person is in their house and suddenly there's a hurricane that runs through their living room and they are in extreme physical danger, just holding on for their life, it is so expected. Also, sexual assault works that way, that there's no way to really prepare for it. Serial assaults are different, but when someone is raped, for instance, there's no expectation. It's just a surprise. It comes out of nowhere. So there's nothing in their psyche that has prepared themselves for this moment. And that adds another dimension to the trauma of it.
That goes back to the question I was asking at the beginning about the extreme, unexpected, and isolating. Having something that is unexpected, I can see how that contributes to that because there's no preparation and that sort of leaning into it. So then, let's get into the juicy stuff. So what have you seen as you've been sorting through the literature and looking at the research and the way that we are responding to this thing? Because it feels as if we're recognizing, even though it is something that's big and severe, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's static and it's stuck there forever.
Yes, people do overcome PTSD. It's important to know that it is treatable. That there's a light at the end of the tunnel, and so that's that. The first time I was surprised in working with somebody, I was in Denmark, and I was at a conference that had other events, but I was talking to a group of 300 people who were not really conversant with energy psychology. And even with a big group like that, I like to do a borrowing the benefits session where I bring one person up, and I find that phobias work really well because usually very often you can resolve the entire phobia in 15 minutes. So I asked who has a phobia, and a number of people raised their hands, and I kind of just quickly checked in with each of them in front of the group, and then I chose one. And it was a young woman who had been in the tsunami in that went through the Indian Ocean in 2004. A terrible tsunami killed 200,000 people, wiped out villages. It was, if most of us probably still remember that as one of the really landmark catastrophic events. And so she had been in the middle of it, and she was just hanging on, and she was seeing people swept away into the sea. She thought her brother had been swept away. It turned out it was somebody else, but she was, so she's describing it. She suddenly is not just describing a memory. She's back in it, and she's going through a full-blown reaction that is, she's dissociated. She doesn't know where she is. She's just overwhelmed with this. And I'm thinking, this is not the phobia that I bargained for. When I asked her what, she just said she was afraid of, she had a phobia of storms. That was all I knew when I brought her up. So I'm watching her go through this, can't have reaction. And I'm thinking, why didn't I choose the one that had the spider phobia? But
that's right.
She starts, I'm able to establish enough contact with her that I get her tapping. And as she's tapping, the reaction starts to subside. She starts to get more control of her breath. She stops shaking. I'm watching as she's tapping. I'm not giving her any words. She's just tapping on it because she doesn't need words to be reminded of what she's going through.
Right.
So we're just tapping, and she's calming and calming. And then she looks quite relaxed. And I ask her what she's experiencing. And she says, it's over. It's over. I'm not afraid anymore. I can still remember the entire experience, but my heart's not beating. I'm not trembling. I just remember it. It wasn't an experience I'd ever like to have again, but she was totally calm. It was just, this is minutes. It was, I was very surprised. I hadn't expected that to happen so quickly. And so that really showed me how powerful tapping can be with a severe trauma. Now, it's it doesn't always go easily like that, but what's happening is that you are sending signals to the amygdala and the rest of the limbic system. When you tap, you are sending signals that deactivate the response. So you tap on these acupuncture points, and then electricity is generated. Certain large molecules do what's called mechanosensory transduction, which actually creates electricity, piezoelectricity, which means electricity caused by pressure. And then it travels along the meridians. It doesn't have to go along the nervous system, synapse to synapse. It goes very quickly to the area of the brains that have been engaged. So when you think about the situation and the parts of the brain that get engaged at that early time are in the limbic system and the amygdala, and they get these signals, the signals say calm down, and the brain calms down. And then the person has what's called a prediction error experience. They're thinking about the situation, but they're not having the response they expect. They're not having the response they always have. And that prediction error is a key to shifting the mental models that we have about our past experiences. So and it can happen very quickly. There's other factors you may have to deal with first, psychological reversals, multiple trauma, all of that, but it can happen very quickly. So that was sort of my initiation into with somebody that had been severely traumatized in a natural disaster. And that and other experiences got me into, I'll confess that when I want to learn about something, I write about it. So I got set up with Noetic Sciences, Institute of Noetic Sciences used to run a really lovely magazine. It's gone the way of many magazines now. Things aren't printed, but back then it was really, and then I talked to the editor and got the assignment of writing about how energy psychology, EFT, TFT, tapping can be used in disaster areas and in the aftermath of disaster. And so that led me on this wonderful journey of talking to the people that had really been there, boots on the ground, really come in right after a disaster. And I talked with many people, and every one of them that I spoke with was able to report experiences that were just remarkable in terms of speed, the amount of hope and help that was given in dire circumstances. And so that led me to write that article. And since then I've followed it up with additional articles. So that's part of the answer to your question of what I've learned.
And so in that process, as you got a chance to, hear from people who are doing the direct work on the ground in that particular way, is there any correlation, connection to the distance in time after the traumatic event that they're getting a chance to have some sort of tool that is being helpful to reprocess, reprogram, deal with what's going on a neurological level? Like, is there significance in immediate as time passes, that sort of thing?
Right. It again depends. For some people, things get worse. The symptoms of isolating, of not having enough sleep, the symptoms of not being able to concentrate, their life gets more disorganized. Their life,
I'm sorry, I asked the question precisely. The time between the event and getting treatment for the event, does that impact the depth and length of what's going on?
Right. It probably in that first month, when the person is having an acute stress reaction, you can't really do the kinds of therapy that you would otherwise do. So, but you can do a lot of good then. You can do things that will make it less likely for it to progress into PTSD.
Okay.
So that's in the short term, that kind of intervention. Let me just say the 4 tiers of energy psychology interventions, because that really speaks.
It is difficult to capture everything that psychology encompasses in just a brief definition, but topics such as development, personality...
Alexa, stop. She heard her name somehow.
My watch does the exact same thing all the time in the middle of sessions. It starts giving me answers that I did not ask it questions of.
Okay, so mark this one again.
Yep.
So the 4 stages. There are 4 tiers that energy psychology can come on after traumatic events, and they really come in at different times. And rather than it being so much the time frame, it depends where the person is and how much they process. So the first tier is immediate relief and stabilization. You come in and you're not interested in their conflict with their father. You're interested in helping them to really regain control of their nervous system. And it can be very simple. You can come in, you're going to make contact with someone and they're really upset. Something's just happened. And you can just say something like, there are ways of breathing that are very calming. Just breathe along with me and model for them deep diaphragmatic breathing. And then after you're trained with them on that, you can say, there are also some stress release points that you can tap on. And this will help you calm further. So as we continue to breathe deeply, tap along with me and just tap as they mimic what you're doing. So it can be that simple to introduce tapping. You don't have to explain the 5,000-year-old acupuncture tradition.
Right.
You don't have to.
And,
Okay,
and I
so
think,
then,
yeah, before we start moving on to the other tiers, I think that's something that's really important for people to hear is that oftentimes in a stressful situation like this or any setting, people don't want a modality. They don't want a tool. They just want to feel better. And the best approach is to say, hey, would you like to calm down a little bit? Would you like to feel a little bit better? Let me show you something really, really simple. And then when they ask questions in history and all of that sort of stuff, when they're well resourced, I know that as a very zealous practitioner 15 years ago, the number of people I talked out of wanting to do something because I just wasn't responding to what they needed. So that's an aside.
right. So in that early phrase, words can be really comforting. Assurance, letting them know that this is a normal response to what they've just been through. They're not really going crazy like they think they are. That it is likely that it will pass in time. If it doesn't pass in a short amount of time, there's help available. Letting them, saying the worst is over, pointing out the obvious, are all ways that can help with that immediate relief and stabilization. Physical things you can do, just having a person hug themselves and rock, havening. Those are all steps in the immediate aftermath. Then the second stage is to disconnect the memory and trigger from the stress response so that you're able to take the memory that they had, and as they're tapping, like happened with the woman on the stage, as they're tapping, it begins to separate out so that they're able to hold the memory or the trigger or the person's voice or whatever the triggers are no longer producing the bodily response and the emotional response. And tapping is kind of amazing in its ability to do that quickly. That's, I think, one of its great advantages. In cognitive behavior therapy, which is still the treatment of choice in conventional settings for PTSD, one of the main techniques is exposure therapy. And we also use exposure therapy by asking someone to go back into the memory, or the memory happens spontaneously. But exposure therapy combined with tapping is totally different from exposure therapy that depends on repetition. In conventional exposure therapy, you just go through the memory 10, 20, 30, 50 times. And eventually the brain does get the experience that nothing bad happened. And so it will overwrite the old memory. With tapping, you don't have to re-traumatize people that way, because at the same time that you're getting their amygdala into strong activation, you're sending signals that bring the activation down. So it happens a lot faster. It's a lot more permanent, because it doesn't just override the old learning. It actually, what neurologists call, depotentiates the old neural pathways. And that's a really important distinction between conventional exposure and tapping. So in the second phase, in the first phase, you're just calming them. In the second phase, you're separating the emotional response from the memory or the trigger.
And I'm guessing that in addition to being more effective, because we're not just overwriting, but we're actually dispersing this memory, I'm guessing the process is gentler as well, because we're constantly downregulating their emotional state while they're replaying the memory and doing that particular thing. So it's not just having to relive it enough times where it's not something that is painful anymore, but we're actually responding to the emotional response they're having as they're replaying that particular memory.
Exactly. Well said. Yeah. So and in terms of your question of how long, often people haven't dealt with the trauma for 20 years. So that's still the second phase. If it's a month later or 20 years later, that's where you go.
Yeah.
Then the third phase gets more complex, because often what happens after trauma is that unresolved psychological issues come up again, or new issues come up again that are kind of waiting in the wings. So you might have early attachment issues that the person has kind of wallpapered over their whole life that pop through, so that they're suddenly very insecure in relationship to the people that they love. Or an earlier trauma that they've kind of tucked away comes up, so that it's not just the recent trauma, but it's also one or more early traumas. So in this third phase is really dealing with the psychological issues that come up, and that could take a much longer time. The first two phases are much more time limited, but this third phase is going to be much more likely to be successful after the first two phases are completed.
And in that process, I'm guessing then whatever energy psychology treatment approach would be useful for dealing with those attachment issues or whatever. Like the work itself is the way it would be even if the person was not coming out of something that was PTSD related. It's just that it is more likely to be prominent and prevalent and coming back because of the catastrophic event. Am I understanding that right?
Yes. Okay. Yes, exactly. And you also, as you're working, always are aware that traumatic experience is in the background. So but beyond that, you'd use the same approach that you would use for depression or anxiety or attachment issues. So it's just kind of with that awareness that this is the context.
And I could also see in that particular setting, for someone who might have at an earlier point in their life done work around that particular issue, having an additional emotion about the issue of, oh, I dealt with this is back again. Maybe that treatment before didn't work. And by having this understanding and recognizing the fact that a catastrophic event can return these things up or amplify things that were done, I could see normalizing that experience for someone who is going through that is going to make it so we're not undermining the work that was done before, them feeling like they're a more hopeless case, because we're able to say, you're absolutely right, normally that would be, but because of this context, this is what's going on.
Yes, as our old friend Paul Horn used to say, another damned opportunity for growth.
At this particular moment in my life, my single favorite tapping phrase is, I appreciate the fact that this is a process, and I'm tired of the fact that it always has to be a process. So it goes right along with that for sure.
Yes. And then the fourth stage, it has to do with post-traumatic growth and really facilitating that when people have gone through a trauma, they often are in worse shape afterwards, but they can also come back to being in better shape. They can discover, okay, what did I learn from this? It often will force them to deal with issues like the inevitability of death, like the existence of evil. All the existential questions often come up in the aftermath of trauma. And for people that are able to successfully deal with those issues, their life becomes richer. And studies of people who have gone through traumatic events, maybe 30 years earlier, and then they look at the course of their life, that event was a changing point where things did get better, where they became more resilient, where they became more confident. So you are really working with those events and those memories to help them to find the spirit that is still alive in there, that is really bright and wanting to shine.
Yeah, and I could also, in addition to getting an opportunity to have fodder to go after those existential issues and existential crises that come from the human experience, I could also see that because I've dealt with something so traumatic, when we're in that tier, that third tier, I'm probably going to be slightly more diligent about doing that work, because it's not like, oh, this thing that's in the back of my mind, but I'm trying to heal from this really big deal. So I'm showing up more concentrated with these things I might have, dealt with enough of them so they're not actually impacting me all of the time. But because they've been returned back up, I'm not going to take it from an 8 to a 4. I'm going to be more committed to go after that particular thing. And it's shining a light on, oh, I can really clean up lots and lots of things as I'm stepping into this particular part.
Yes. Yeah, that's a really good observation, that as people deal with their worst experiences, they become less scared to take on whatever comes up.
Yeah. Is there, you mentioned the part where you were really surprised in working with someone in that public setting. As you were reading through the research, looking at studies, talking to folks who are in the field, was there anything else that particularly struck you or surprised you as you were doing that? Or it was something that was nagging at the back of your head as a possibility, and then all of a sudden it was confirmed by folks in the field who are doing this sort of stuff? Was there any kind of other nuggets or things in that process kind of went, that's fascinating, or, ooh, I really love knowing that particular piece of it?
Right there. The whole, mental health people really have their hearts in the right place. Mm-hmm. And people that have worked with trauma have come up with really good perspectives and training programs, etc. What seems to be a thread in the most effective ones is the realization that you need to work with the body as well as the mind. So Bessel van der Kolk wrote, "The body keeps the score," and has really encouraged somatic therapies as a way of working with PTSD and extreme trauma. And he's absolutely right. And his book has been a #1 bestseller on the Times nonfiction list for longer than, I don't know if it's longer than any book, but certainly for any book of that genre. Just months. Yeah. So it really touched a nerve in the culture.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's one of those things that, again, the reason why I phrased the question that particular way, oftentimes there's stuff that we understand, but then we have some sort of external experience that gives vocabulary to this thing on a gut soul level. We're like, this is the way it works. I just don't know how to express it. And then all of a sudden there's experiences in the world and people are going, yes. And all of a sudden we're able to wrap our arms around it in a way that allow us to respond significantly more usefully.
Yeah. So I think it's just reassuring to know that we're right, that working at the body level is what's called for.
Awesome. Well, as always, David, I appreciate your insight and your time. And, it just, the work that you continue to do makes my life so much easier as I'm turning to the people around me going, well, what's going on? I'm like, well, actually, here's something my friend wrote. Actually, here's a really great way for us to think about it. So in addition to expanding our knowledge, you're making all of our lives easier as we're able to communicate with those who are less fluent in this stuff, because it's not just, my crazy Uncle Gene is saying something. There's actually some other stuff that's backing it up. So I always appreciate your work, and most importantly, appreciate your time. Thanks a lot, David.
Thank you, Gene. That's, for Crazy Uncle, you're really getting a lot of people turned on to important ideas. I really appreciate what you're doing.
If you found this interview inspiring, I would encourage you to support the Peaceful Heart Network by going to 24hoursoftapping.com/support or clicking the link in the description. And you will see on the screen right now a playlist to all of the interviews from this year's and last year's 24 Hours of Tapping. I hope you enjoyed those as well.